In 2018, something unsettling happened in India. A food product that was sitting in Indian kitchens for years, which was considered to be safe, which was certified and advertised to be safe, was suddenly found to contain lead. Lead, one of the most dangerous substances for children. A substance that can cause developmental disorders, both physical and mental. Now, the question arises, if we have bodies like the FSSAI, the Food Safety and Standards Authority of India, then why does contaminated and adulterated food still reaches our plates? Entire shelves and batches were recalled. Parents panicked, doctors were warned, and news channels ran debates night after night. This product wasn't smuggled, it wasn't homemade, it certainly wasn't illegal. Then how did this happen? How did this product pass the quality check? How did it pass the system? The same system that was designed to protect you. Now, the FSSAI was under direct fire. Samples tested by independent labs showed contamination far above allowed limits. This product was briefly recalled, pulled off the shelves. A lot of statements were released by officials too. And here a very strange thing happened. There were no criminal charges, no executives were jailed either, and also there was no meaningful change in the system. A few months later, the product was back in the shelves. People forgot, and life moved on. Now pause for a second and think about this. If the product is consumed by millions and the said product can pass through approvals, inspections and renewals and still expose people to neurotoxins, then what exactly is the system doing? Because this wasn't an isolated failure. Over the years, India has seen excessive pesticides in vegetables, antibiotics residues in milk, and adulterated spices were sent back to India after they were flagged to be unsafe. Packaged foods that were banned overseas were legally sold in India. And every single time, the authorities have the same response. Samples are being tested. The matter is under investigation. There is no cause for panic. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You see, food safety failures don't explode like scandals. They leak slowly, silently, over years. A child doesn't collapse the same day he consumes something adulterated, something that isn't supposed to be consumed. But he suffers later in life. He suffers from developmental disorders. He suffers from immunity problems and chronic illnesses. But by then, the responsibility is already evaporated. Now, this isn't just an Indian problem. The US also faces similar scandals. Europe has recalled entire product lines over substances that were once considered safe. Different countries, different regulators, but the same pattern. Now, this brings us to the real question. If laws exist, if agencies exist, if science exists, then why do we see all these problems? How come unsafe food is consumed by our children? And most importantly, who benefits from such poor law enforcement? Now, to understand why this keeps happening, we need to step back a little. Because before we talk about the failures of these agencies, we need to understand why they were created in the first place. After stories like these break, a familiar question always follows. Don't we have regulatory agencies for this? Isn't there an authority body that's looking after our food? Well, yes, technically. On paper at least. In India, this responsibility lies with the FSSAI. Now, a lot of people think of this organization as a watchdog, an organization that is constantly inspecting factories, testing food, and shutting down violators. Now, this image looks reassuring, but that's not really the truth. The FSSAI's official mandate is broad, vague, and ambitious. It is supposed to set safety standards for food products and approve ingredients and additives, test samples for contamination, penalize violators, protect public health, etc. etc. In theory, at least, nothing can reach your plate without passing this system. So when you see a packaged product on the shelf with a license number printed neatly on the back, your brain makes an assumption that this product has been checked, an assumption that this product is safe to consume. This assumption is the foundation of consumer trust. FSSAI is not designed to test every batch of food. It doesn't sit inside factories. It doesn't monitor supply chains in real time either. Instead, the system relies heavily on self-compliance by companies, periodic inspections, random sampling, third-party testing labs. In other words, this system assumes good faith first. And that assumption matters because food manufacturing today is not small scale. It is industrial. It is high volume. It is high margin. Time sensitive. Cutting corners can save lakhs if not crores. But here's the contradiction. On one side, a regulator is tasked with protecting hundreds of millions of people. On the other, corporations are producing food at mass scale, which makes it very difficult for the regulators to keep an eye on the whole process. The regulator doesn't taste your food. He doesn't eat what you eat. It certifies processes, not outcomes. So when something goes wrong, people point fingers at the FSSAI. But how much power does this organization have in reality? To make sense of this, we need to go back in time. To understand the limitations of FSSAI, we need to understand why this organization was created in the first place. The food safety agencies were not created as scams. They served a clear purpose. They were created to reduce harm. They were created because things were genuinely worse before. Now, before the creation of FSSAI in the mid 2000s, Indian food standards were fragmented, outdated, and chaotic. Now, to get everything streamlined, something had to be done. There were multiple laws, multiple authorities, but very little coordination. Public health incidents were frequent, but somehow the accountability was still missing. This chaos led to the creation of FSSAI in 2006. However, this agency didn't become operational till 2008. The idea was simple: one law, one regulator, and clear standards. And for a while, it worked. Now, what exactly did FSSAI improve after it was created? After its formation, this agency did bring some real changes. Mandatory food licensing created traceability. Labeling laws forced the disclosure of ingredients. Hygiene standards became uniform across states. Large-scale adulteration was visibly reduced, and small-scale manufacturers were pulled into a formal framework. Now, to the average consumer, the food looks safer. And it really was. Globally, organizations like the FDA saw similar successes. For example, reduction in acute food poisoning outbreaks, elimination of some visibly toxic substances, and standardized safety thresholds. These systems had a purpose. They weren't useless. So where did things started going wrong? The problems began when food systems evolved faster than regulation. Modern food is no longer just food. It is chemically preserved, highly processed, engineered for shelf life, and optimized for cost, not nutrition. Thousands of additives, preservatives, and processing aids were added to the system. And regulators made a quiet shift. Instead of proving something was safe, they literally started allowing things that were considered dangerous, because proving long-term harm takes years of exposure, large population data, and independent research. By the time clear evidence appears, it's already too late. Millions have already consumed that stuff. You see, FSSAI was never built to conduct long-term toxicological research, monitor chronic exposure effects, challenge powerful multinational corporations. Its framework focuses on compliance, not precaution. This means that when the harm is slow, subtle, and distributed, the system struggles to respond. FSSAI often succeeds at stopping immediate visible dangers, but it was never equipped to handle invisible long-term ones. And in this gap lie most of our current-day problems. Now let's look at how agencies like the FSSAI erode public trust. Up to this point, everything can be explained away. No system is perfect. Mistakes happen. Scale can definitely be a challenge in a country like India. But then came along the cases that cannot be brushed aside so easily. Cases where the problem wasn't the absence of rules, but failure to act, even when the red flags were visible. In multiple instances over the last decade, food products in India were found to contain excess pesticide residue, antibiotics in milk beyond permissible limits, heavy metals in spices and packaged food. But what makes these cases disturbing is not just the contamination, it's the response. Products were often tested, flagged, and publicly discussed, and yet bans were delayed, penalties were minimal, and the same brands continued their business as usual without any major repercussions. And sometimes these food products that were rejected by foreign regulators are sold domestically. The message was subtle and clear. The substances that are unacceptable in other places can definitely be acceptable here, at least temporarily. We often hear one phrase repeating over and over again in our food safety news: a notice has been issued. Not a shutdown, not a prosecution, but a notice. This matters because large-scale corporations understand one thing very well: risk calculation. If the worst outcome of a violation is a warning, a small fine, temporary suspension, then unsafe practices become a business decision, not a deterrent. This is where global relevance comes in. In the United States, the FDA faces similar criticism. Substances banned in Europe but allowed in the US. Additives approved decades ago without any long-term studies, using lobbying to allow unethical practices. Different agencies, but the same structural weakness. Regulators often react after the harm has been caused, after the public has been exposed to the contaminant. And when the harm is slow, the regulators move even slower. One of the most unsettling patterns here in India is the exported food. You see, a lot of the times what we export to other countries gets rejected because of safety standards. Now, these products aren't dumped, they are recycled in a way domestically. They will be rerouted and relabeled, and somehow all of this is legal, by the way. Now that raises another question. Does our health matter so little? Are our safety thresholds designed around public health or around what the industry can tolerate? Enforcement is reactive, punishment is survivable, and the consumer absorbs all the risk. And by this point, trust doesn't collapse dramatically. It erodes slowly. Now let's look at what happens inside these organizations that allow such chaos. In 2015, Nestle's Maggie, which was consumed by millions of Indians, was suddenly declared unsafe. FSSAI and state food authorities made two explosive claims. The first claim was the presence of excess lead way beyond permissible limits, and the second claim was the presence of MSG. Now, according to regulators, this was a problem because the label clearly said no added MSG. Within days, Maggie was pulled off all the shelves nationwide. States imposed bans. The company also reported a loss of more than 4,000 crore rupees in market value. And our media went crazy with the headlines as usual. Poison in your food. Children at risk. What have we been eating all these years? And the public trust collapsed. Not just in Maggie, but in the entire food regulatory system. And here's where FSSAI's credibility truly tanked. When this Maggie case reached courts and independent labs, things got uncomfortable real fast. Multiple accredited labs produced conflicting results. Testing procedures done by some state labs were questioned. And the funny part was there was no standardized and reproducible testing protocol. The courts asked a very simple question. If this food is contaminated and unsafe to consume, then why aren't government labs being able to prove this consistently? Eventually, the Bombay High Court removed the ban on Maggie, and Maggie was allowed back into the market after retesting. And Nestle was not convicted of endangering public health. No decisive punishment, no admission of error, and no accountability. This case wasn't just about noodles. It was about the structural failures inside of the FSSAI, inconsistent testing standards across states, poor coordination between the central and state authorities, lack of transparency as to how the conclusions were drawn, and regulatory panic instead of scientific certainty. If the food was genuinely dangerous, why was the ban overturned? And if the food was safe, then why was the public terrified for months? Either ways, somebody failed real bad here. There was a silent damage, and trust was never recovered. After Maggie returned to the shelves, the FSSAI did not release a clear public explanation. There was no institutional introspection, no overhaul visible to ordinary citizens. Now, because of this, to a lot of Indians, the FSSAI looked like an organization that reacts after the damage is done. A body that cannot defend its own decisions. It looked like a system where media pressure decides urgency and not science. And this is very dangerous because food safety depends more on trust than on laws. Even now, whenever a new food controversy breaks, be it spices, packaged snacks, supplements, or baby food, people ask the same question. Is this just another Maggie situation? A regulator's worst failure isn't letting one bad product slip through, but it's making people doubt every warning it issues afterward. This Maggie case didn't just damage a brand, it damaged trust. Now let's look at what happens inside of these organizations. By now, this one thing should be obvious, that this isn't about ignorance. The regulators clearly know contamination exists. Now, if they know that these problems exist, why don't we see any action? The answer isn't hidden in law books or technical guidelines. It exists within the system itself. Regulatory capture. Imagine you hire a guard to protect your house. At first, he's alert, suspicious, doing his job. Then slowly he starts interacting with people whom he's supposed to keep an eye on. And then these thieves offer this guard a lot of things. They offer help. Soon this guard starts to empathize with the thieves. And now this guard deliberately lets the thieves in. This is called regulatory capture. It happens when regulators begin to depend on the industry for data and expertise, when they share professional circles with those they're supposed to regulate, move between authority roles in public sector to industry and consultancy jobs in the private sector. Now, because of this, over time, strict enforcement starts to feel disruptive. The watchdog doesn't disappear. It just stops biting. Weak punishment. Now imagine the same guard finally catching a thief. Now instead of handing over this thief to the cops, the guard simply demands a small fine and lets the thief go with a warning. The thief now pays the fine and returns the next week. That's how weak punishment works. If violation leads to warnings, temporary suspensions, and fines smaller than company profits, then those penalties stop being a punishment and start being a business expense. Large food corporations don't fear notices. They prepare for them. They plan for them. Without serious criminal liability or meaningful consequences, the enforcement loses all its teeth and compliance becomes optional. The illusion of oversight. From the outside, it feels like regulators are everywhere. Licenses, inspections, compliance certificates. But inside the system, the reality looks very different. There are too few inspectors and too many food businesses. Our testing capabilities are also very limited. Hence, the inspections are infrequent and predictable, and sometimes these are announced in advance. Now, this creates a dangerous illusion. Food looks safe on the inspection day, But food safety isn't a performance, is it? Systems built on predictable oversight encourage appearances, not protection. Outsource trust. A large part of our food safety relies on private labs, contract testing, and self reported compliance. This means that even the tests are compromised. So now the question isn't is the food safe, but rather who paid for the test. When clean results benefit everybody involved, uncomfortable findings tend to disappear. I mean, why would you want to hurt yourself? When oversight becomes this weak, honesty becomes a rarity. Political and economic pressure. Food isn't just food. It's jobs, it's exports, it's revenue, it's political influence. Strict enforcement can shut down factories, which can cause backlash, both economic and political. So regulators face an unspoken pressure. Be careful how hard you push. This is where public health becomes a balancing act. And balance more often than not goes in the favor of those who are in power. Chronic harm. Food safety failures rarely cause dramatic emergencies. Instead, they cause slightly higher cancer rates, metabolic disorders, developmental issues, and long-term chronic illness. All these harms accumulate slowly. Systems designed to respond to crises often struggle to act against problems that unfold over decades. So nothing collapses, nothing explodes. You see, the system never fails loudly. It adapts. It absorbs criticism, it issues guidelines, it gives statements. But the structure largely remains the same. There are no changes to that. You see, the system isn't broken in the way people think it is, but rather it is functioning exactly as its incentives allow. If this feels bleak, it should. But understanding the problem gives us control, because once you see where incentives distort behavior, where accountability disappears, or power overrides protection, you can talk about realistic change, not slogans, solutions. Systems like the FSSAI don't collapse overnight. They shift, they change according to the incentives. So the question isn't how do we make regulators perfect, but rather it is about how do we create an environment where doing the right thing is easier than doing the wrong one. That is where the real reform lies. 1. Break the revolving door. Now let's go back to the watchman analogy. You don't let your guard watch your house today and then go and work for the thieves the next day. Yet that's how exactly a lot of regulatory careers work. So let's change a few things. Let's have cooling off periods before regulators join the industry. We need to ban regulators overseeing sectors they recently worked in. We should have a transparent disclosure of the conflicts of interest. 2. Make punishments hurt. Rules without consequences aren't rules, they are suggestions. If violating food safety laws leads to fines that barely put a dent in the profits, if it leads to temporary suspensions that resume quietly, if there's no personal liability for the decision makers, then nothing changes. Real deterrence means fines proportional to the revenue, not a fixed amount. Criminal liability for intentional and repeated violations. Public disclosure that follows companies and not press cycles. You see, when breaking rules becomes expensive, compliance is no longer optional. 3. Make oversight unpredictable. If inspections happen rarely, on schedule, and with a prior notice, they don't measure safety, they measure performance. We change that and the whole system changes. That means we need to have randomized inspections, surprise sampling, rotating inspectors across regions. 4. Take testing back under public control. Food safety shouldn't depend entirely on who pays for the test. I'm not against private labs, but they can be a nuisance. They do have a role, but they cannot have unchecked power. Usually, it is the results from these private labs that the corporations use to push their products. A stronger system includes random government retesting of market samples, independent audits of private labs, and severe penalties for compromised results. Testing should always answer this one question: is this food safe? And not, will it make anybody angry? 5. Protect the regulator from political pressure. This is uncomfortable but essential. Regulators cannot protect public health if their jobs depend on political comfort. Now, to get rid of this problem, we need to have fixed tenures for the officials, clear legal protection for enforcement duties, separation between economic ministries and safety regulators. Food safety isn't an economic policy tool, it is public service. 6. Track harm over time. If damage happens slowly, systems must learn to see slowly. That means long-term exposure tracking, health data linked to food consumption patterns, early warning indicators before the crisis explodes. 7. Transparency. What we need here is real visibility. We need to see that what these organizations actually do. And for that, transparency is absolutely essential. We need to have public access to inspection outcomes. We also need to have an open and comprehensive database of all the safety violations. Clear explanation of enforcement decisions too. If people can see patterns and not just isolated events, the pressure becomes sustained. Be it a government agency or a large corporation, they don't respond to morality. They respond to pressure. They respond to structure and cost. Change these things and the behavior changes. Our goal here isn't to create heroic regulators, but it is to build a system where one simply cannot afford to fail the public. We often like to believe that systems fail when people don't care, that someone was asleep at the wheel, that someone was lazy, that someone was lying. But the truth is far more uncomfortable than that. You see, most of the times the system is awake. It sees the problems, it understands the risk, it knows the consequences, and yet it doesn't budge. Because our systems have slowly morphed into these abominations, and it has been normalized to the point where an average Indian doesn't seem to care. A little contamination here, a delayed inspection there, a fine that doesn't hurt anybody important, nothing dramatic, nothing urgent. Protecting people became managing outrage, enforcement became explanation, safety became paperwork, and slowly, quietly, the guards stopped guarding. This happened because incentives were designed in such a way, because comfort replaced distance, because power learned how to bend rules without breaking them. It also means that if incentives have caused these problems, incentives alone can fix this. Not slogans, not outrage cycles, and not performative bans. You see, food safety isn't about perfection, but it is about refusing to accept slow harm as normal.